Hello, and welcome to this exclusive interview with a truly exciting guest today. My name is Anvesh Jain, current research analyst and former program editor with the Nato Association of Canada. But you're not here for me. Our guest today is a well-respected and longtime member of our National Diplomatic Corps. I am pleased to introduce Ambassador David Angell, current Canadian ambassador and permanent representative to the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, or NATO. He completed his bachelor's in political science from Yale University in 1986, his master's in political science from the University of Toronto in 1987, and his master's in philosophy from the University of Cambridge in 1988. He has served as Assistant Secretary to the Cabinet, Foreign and Defense Policy at the Privy Council Office since 2016. He has served as High Commissioner to countries such as Kenya and Nigeria. Mr. Angell was the G8 Deputy Personal Representative and Personal Representative for Africa, and as such, a principal organizer of the 2002 and 2010 G8 summits at Kananaskis and Muskoka. He has served at the United Nations from 1996 to 2011, including as alternate representative on the UN Security Council between 1999 and 2000. Before that, he was the advisor to General Jean de Chastelain on the International Body on the Decommissioning of Arms in 1995, and the multi-party negotiations in Northern Ireland in 1996. Mr. Angell has also served at the Embassy in Washington, D.C. between 1991 and 1993. And lastly, he is a recipient of the Queen Elizabeth II Diamond Jubilee Medal. Our conversation today will touch on themes of Canadian-African relations, nation building, Canadian-NATO relations, the complexities of alliance politics, NATO during COVID-19, and finally, careers in diplomacy. So, Ambassador Angell, after that lengthy introduction, I hope you are keeping well in these uncertain times. Thank you sincerely for agreeing to be here and to chat with the NATO Association of Canada. How are you doing?
I'm doing well, and thank you very much for having me. Pleasure to meet you, Anvesh, and pleasure to be speaking with the members of the association.
Okay, thank you. First, let's talk about NATO's official response to the COVID-19 pandemic. What role has Canada played in shaping that response?
Well, these are unprecedented times for NATO as for everybody else. The first order of business for NATO is maintaining our ability to do our normal work, to allow for the collective security of the allies, to work with partners in pursuit of cooperative security, and to keep our operations underway. And we've done that. We've had 3 ministerial meetings, important decisions taken, even against the backdrop of COVID. NATO is not a frontline agency the way the WHO is, but it still has a very important role to play in responding to COVID. For example, in deploying huge numbers of heavy lift flights to bring essential kit, to help build over almost 100 field hospitals. And the Alliance has been working to make sure that it supplies the necessary kit and other support to its own members, but also to partners. And Canada has been part of that. We've had, in addition to the assistance that all the allies, most of the allies are providing, including Canada, in our case to 3 of our allies and to a large number of partners, ministers have taken important decisions to prepare for a second wave. And ministers have taken important decisions to put in place arrangements to allow for baseline planning in each of the allied capitals, to put in place stockpiles, funding, in other words, to prepare for a major second wave should it come. We've also been very active, unfortunately, in having to address disinformation, of which there's been a fair amount. We've seen that with regard to troops participating in enhanced forward presence operations. We've seen it in terms of some of the storylines that have been perpetrated, or whatever the right verb is, with regard to the support that NATO allies have been providing to each other and to others.
Okay. So it is said that much of backdoor diplomacy revolves around the interpersonal relationships between official representatives and members of the various civil services. So because of COVID-19 and because of this response you've been talking about, how has your work as an ambassador been affected by quarantine, both at the official and interpersonal levels? What new or memorable adjustments have you had to make?
Well, in some ways, our day-to-day work here has been less affected than in other diplomatic corridors. NATO is a slightly unusual diplomatic beast in that it operates essentially as a council. And the closer analogy is the international financial institutions. And so my job as the ambassador to the North Atlantic Council is essentially to interact with the other members of the council and to interact with the NATO leadership, whether the civilian leadership, such as the Secretary General and his deputy and the Assistant Secretaries General, or the military leadership. So in that sense, we do less outreach than ambassadors would normally do, and we spend an awful lot of time interacting with each other. Because NATO is a military alliance, we have never stopped operating as we ordinarily would. All the delegations have put in place shift systems to minimize the risk to their personnel, but we've always had in-person meetings throughout the pandemic, and that continues. And as I mentioned, we put in place new high secure technology so that our ministers can meet remotely. But the ambassadors and our teams have been continuing to meet face-to-face from the very outset of the pandemic.
Okay, perfect. So moving now to talk a bit more about your career as a whole. You've served Canadian foreign affairs in a distinguished variety of global missions and theaters. Are there any personal triumphs or policy breakthroughs that you're particularly proud of having a hand in engineering? Now's your chance to brag.
Well, you mentioned the dates of my various graduations, and you'll have ascertained that I'm not young from that. As I look back on a 30-year career at this point, the first observation is that there are no personal triumphs. Nothing gets done in this field individually. It's all done as part of teams. And I've had the enormous privilege in the course of my career of working with some of our giants, people like Bob Fowler, Paul Heinbecker, John DeShastelin, whom you mentioned. And together we've accomplished an enormous amount. As I look back, highlights would include the Northern Ireland work that you mentioned with General DeShastelin. I was there at the early stage, the decommissioning stage, and putting in place the structure for the negotiations that led to the Good Friday Agreement. The General did many years of work after I left his side, but still enormous satisfaction in the outcome that was achieved. When we were on the UN Security Council, Canada did some truly important work, first of all, in making the sanctions against the UNITA rebel force in Angola work, as a result of which, first of all, the two-generation-long civil war was brought to an end, and the international community figured out how to deal with conflict diamonds. And in that same period, at Lloyd Axworthy's initiative as foreign minister, we put in place an important initiative to make protection of civilians in armed conflict a focus of the Security Council's work. It wasn't before. This was 4 or 5 years after Rwanda and Srebrenica. And now, 21 years on, we've had important reports by the Secretary General and by OCHA commemorating this and essentially acknowledging the remarkable conceptual transformation it brought about. So those are 3 highlights, but we have a very gifted foreign service, and Canada has a lot of other accomplishments in that period too that I hope I've contributed to, at least on the margins.
3 of many, I'm sure. So intense disruptions seem to be the hallmark of this era, both at home and abroad. Many familiar institutions are being re-examined in new lights and under new critical discourses. In your view, is there any familiarity of an institution like NATO at a time like this? And in the grander theme of a world moving towards great power competition, what is the place of the NATO alliance, and what is Canada's place within that geopolitical bloc?
Well, NATO is one of the handful of international organizations that are truly important to Canada, and that importance has not waned. We were one of the original architects, and the organization that we helped to create has proven to be remarkably adaptable, and because of that, it is as relevant today as it was when it was created in the late 1940s. We're living in a world that is less safe than the world I grew up in. We see that in powers trying to reassert their role in the international system. We see that with new forms of warfare, new types of weapon systems. And we see that in some fundamental norms being violated. And for NATO, many of our day-to-day realities are shaped by the ongoing occupation of parts of Georgia and Ukraine. So it's a less safe world than the world I grew up in, and NATO's role is all the more important. Now, if you look at NATO as an institution, in my 30 years, I've been involved in a great many multilateral bodies. I've never been part of one that is more effective or adaptable than NATO. First of all, it's extremely strongly led, both in terms of the individual leadership. Jens Stoltenberg is outstanding, but the structure, the fact that we have an organization that has the machinery that NATO does has served us extremely well. Now, we don't rest on laurels. For example, leaders, when they met in London in December, decided to put in place a reflection process to look afresh at the political elements of NATO's work and to see what we can do better. It's a project that started from a position of strength. The Allies are very confident with the role and place of NATO, but we believe that we can always do things better. And so we have a very high-powered panel looking at what can be done differently. And Canada is privileged to have a very senior member on that panel, Greta Bossenmeyer, who used to be the National Security and Intelligence Advisor to the Prime Minister. So we're part of this discussion to further strengthen NATO and to make better use of our partnerships.
You mentioned Jens Stoltenberg. During his visit to Toronto last summer, I was actually working the door. And what really stood out to me was that he actually took time to greet and shake the hand of every single volunteer. So I can personally speak to the quality of the leadership at NATO.
Yeah, we're very strongly led. Jens is, I think, if not the longest serving, one of the longest serving secretaries general, has enormous support around the table. His deputy from Romania, new but very, very strong. Wherever I look, whether it's the civilian side or the military side or my colleagues around the table, this is a very well-run organization.
Okay, so a lot of people, because of pandemic, they've been stuck at home. They've had to probably be in more contact with their friends or their roommates or their families than they've ever really had to in the past. And this might be leading to some tension or friction in the home life. So you had a role in the multi-party negotiations over Northern Ireland in 1996. Given your experience in conflict negotiations and peace building, can you share any advice on how to practice those same skills and processes in other settings, such as the home, the workplace, or in politics?
Yeah, I mean, every household should have a peacemaker. In our case, it's the family dog. But no, any conflict situation or other dynamic has a couple of common traits. You have to understand the interests that are at play, and whether that's family members or negotiating parties, still individuals and individuals with interests. You have to understand the context. And as you say, it's an unusual context that we're in. And you have to take decisions that are grounded in an understanding of the realities. And that's true at the Northern Ireland negotiating table. It was true 20 years ago, and it's true in navigating the realities of the COVID pandemic, household by household and country by country. You also have to be kind to each other, and that's something I keep reminding my team. This is a pressureful time for everyone, and just the same way that peace negotiations are pressureful, day-to-day life has become pressureful, and we have to look out for each other.
I'll be sure to tell my roommate that later today.
Having a big space in which to coexist is also useful.
Yes. So students nowadays have more opportunities than ever to translate their learning into a variety of professional and technical endeavors, particularly in the lucrative private sector. According to you, why should national service and a career in the civil bureaucracy still appeal as an option to graduates of Canada's top educational programs?
Well, when I joined the public service 1,000 years ago, there were fewer options. But despite the fact that people coming out of university have many more choices today, I really would urge that public service be considered amongst them. A couple of reasons. One is you really can make a difference in a way that's not the case in many professions. You can make a difference in your own country, and as a diplomat, you can make a difference on the international stage. And some of the examples I gave before, being part of the Northern Ireland peace process, or helping organize a major summit, or taking forward UN Security Council work, I mean, these are all enormous privileges. There is a degree of variety and stimulation that is truly unusual. As a rotational foreign service officer, we basically change jobs every 2 or 3 years. You work with extraordinary people. And at the end of the day, we Canadians can, because we have an extremely strong public service, one of the best in the world, nonpartisan, highly professional, we sometimes take the public service for granted. But in my experience, living for many years in Africa, working on countries in conflict, the thing that seems to really matter in societies getting ahead is trusted public institutions. And we're lucky as Canadians to have trusted public institutions, but we should not take that for granted. And one of the privileges of being a public servant is you contribute to that trust.
That's a fantastic answer. So we're nearing the end of our interview today, and this is something I've been asking a lot of people this summer. I asked Lieutenant General Christine Whitecross this a couple of weeks ago as well. But given the pandemic, given all these transitions, given the general state of the world, what's been keeping you going, Ambassador David Angell, and what gives you hope?
Well, the importance of the work we do has not been set back by COVID. If anything else, it's made the world more complicated and made Canada's contribution to it more important, and made NATO's role as a pillar of a rules-based international order more important as well. So, what gets all of us going in the morning is the sense of adding value. And as the world becomes more complicated, it's just all the nicer to be on the side of a country that's actually making a difference within an organization that's making a difference.
Thank you. And with those words of wisdom and hope, our interview now comes to a close. Ambassador Angell, I can't thank you enough for taking the time to speak with us today. Your experiences and your insights from the world of Canadian diplomacy are equal parts fascinating and invaluable. I'm sure we all learned quite a bit over the course of today's interview. I wish you all the best in your work representing Canada's interests at the highest tables of the NATO alliance. Be well and come back to Canadian shores soon. Thanks once again.
Pleasure speaking with you, Anvesh. Thank you very much.
Thanks once again. Be sure to follow us on our social media channels for more interviews, articles, and analysis on all things NATO and Canada. This is Anvesh Jain, signing off on behalf of the NATO Association of Canada.